Hello, and I'm really, really sorry. Want to apologize for not being able to be with you in person. This is going to be a very important discussion before the budget, and I wish I could have joined you. I'm currently in Johannesburg in South Africa, where I've been presenting a report by a committee on inequality that was set up by the South African G20 presidency. And talking about that report to various global leaders made me realize how much inequality can be misinterpreted or misunderstood in so many different ways, and how data can be presented in ways that often mislead rather than perhaps represent the reality. We had the Indian delegation at the meeting point out that India is now the fourth least unequal country in the world, and that poverty has been reduced dramatically and inequality has come down significantly, that Gini coefficients are lower. And of course, a lot of this depends on how the data are collected and how they are, shall we say, manipulated. But it is also true that many of these measures are themselves faulty. And I think this is very important for us to remember when we are looking at the impacts of macroeconomic effects in terms of the different gendered effects and in terms of the effects across classes and across people in different locations. Because often we are presented with information that appears to show that something is good or is a positive trend or reflects a good outcome, when it could well be the other way around. And similarly, we could actually see negative consequences when perhaps the reality is more complex, both ways. Specifically with regard to inequality, our report talks about various kinds of inequality, the dimensions, as well as the gendered and the interactions of income and asset inequality with class and caste and race and a bunch of other things. But one of the things we found globally, and this is also true in India, is that the share of wages in national income has been coming down substantially over the past 2 decades, and that the share of capital and therefore other forms of surplus has risen, but also that concentration within capital has gone up. So it is not just that wage shares have fallen, but that there is greater concentration, first of all, among wages, among capital, that the richest and largest corporations get the most profits. Within the largest corporations, the top 100 corporations get the most profits. Within the top 100 corporations, the mega corporations owned by favored capitalists get the most profits. And this is a tendency that is increasing. But we also find that wage shares are falling, but within that, wage inequality is increasing because some categories of workers continue to do very well or actually much better than before, specifically in sectors like finance and so on. And other workers struggle and, in fact, experience deteriorating conditions. And I think you will find that this is as true of India as it is of most of the countries that we looked at globally. This is very important for us to remember because it is these disaggregated impacts that we have to look at very, very specifically when we analyze macroeconomic data and the impacts of things like the budgets. So when you are doing your pre-budget analysis, and I know you're going to do a really fine job in terms of the sectoral disaggregations and so on, I think it's also important to recognize how numbers can be interpreted differently and presented differently in ways that often create the opposite impression. I was looking at some of the recent data for the Indian economy, and just now I looked at the RBI's monthly economic survey for India because it shows that the Indian economy is doing remarkably well, apparently, that everything is much more resilient than was earlier anticipated, that the Trump tariff threat has had some impact, but it's not very bad, that that all the sectors are showing great resilience. Agriculture, because it's a good monsoon, manufacturing and construction also doing reasonably well, and services also showing greater resilience. They are also showing employment indicators picking up, which I confess was a surprise to me. The unemployment rate has remained stable, but the employment indicators, they say, have improved, particularly driven by an increase in women's employment. So this, of course, is another source of, shall we say, interest, because it conflicts with a lot of the perceived reality that many of us notice around us. So I delved a little deeper by looking at the latest periodic labor force survey. And once again, this increase in employment is driven by women's employment, yes. It's particularly driven by rural women's employment. And within that, it's particularly driven by the increase in what is nicely called contributing family workers, that is, unpaid helpers in family and enterprises, which in very few other countries in the world would be called employment at all. So if you look only at paid employment of women, that is stagnant or falling. And we also know that it's becoming more fragile. I didn't have time to look at the wage data specifically for paid employment, but for the latest period. But I do know that over the last decade, the paid employment of women the wages have not increased and the incomes from self-employment have fallen. So these are concerns which are not presented when you look at, let's say, aggregate numbers that have been put together in a certain way and, shall we say, presented in a certain way. Okay, in that background, let's consider the broad macroeconomic context within which next year's budget will be presented and the concerns that we must have in terms of what may likely happen. Okay, now the various surveys and presentations by the government suggest that the Indian economy has been relatively resilient to the Trump threats, although it is certainly true that exports to the United States have fallen, but they were, as we have said from the beginning, a relatively small share of Indian exports, and they have been concentrated in certain sectors. But we have to remember that the sectors that are already affected and are likely to continue to be affected are labor-intensive sectors, particularly textiles and garments, and gems and jewelry and footwear. These are sectors that have already been affected and will continue to be affected whatever trade deal is struck in the near future, because we have seen from experience that all these trade deals still leave us with higher tariffs than existed earlier, and probably higher tariffs than several other trading partners of the US. So we need to consider specifically what is the impact on women in these sectors. We know that textiles and garments and the leather sectors are women-intensive. They're not just labor-intensive, they're women-intensive sectors. Gems and jewelry less so, which is another badly affected sector. We know that the pharma sector has been recently, there's been 100% tariff imposed on that, which is definitely certainly going to impact sales, even though it does not apply to generics. But all of these are bound to have specific impacts on employment in specific states and regions, as well as in very specific sectors. So what is being done about that? Is there any attempt to provide compensation packages, rehabilitation packages, recovery packages, packages to assist these sectors to recover and redirect their activities either to the domestic market or to regional markets or other export markets? What is being planned for the sectors that we know are already badly affected and are likely to be worse affected? This is something that should be asked in terms of what the budget is going to provide. And we hope that those of you who are going to be looking at the budget will also focus and hone in on some of those areas where it's already going to be, already has been a bad impact or is very likely to be a bad impact. But then there are other concerns. Supposing, in fact, we do strike a trade deal with the United States, we really have no idea what it will contain, because these trade negotiations are completely opaque. They're done in secret, and they're really announced to the Indian public subsequently. The way they are announced often does not reveal the devil in the details. it often pretends that something is actually a victory or a win-win, and our media tend to actually emphasize all of that as well, which can be very misleading. What we do know of other trade deals that the United States has struck is that they have been deeply damaging for the countries concerned, and that many people within those countries are worried that these are trade deals that were struck to benefit certain sectors or certain capitalists and have medium-term and long-term negative impacts on the economy. Indonesia is a case in point. In Indonesia, the desire to keep the basically garments and other light manufacturing exports to the United States surviving, because a lot of employment was in those sectors, and to continue with some of the exports of nickel and so on, which are important for Indonesia. A deal has been struck which deregulates all the sectors in the Indian economy for US companies. In other words, American multinationals will not face any of the financial, environmental, land acquisition, and other regulatory constraints that other capitalists face, even Indonesian domestic capitalists. And this is deeply concerning. It means that you can get polluting industries from the US there. You can get all kinds of other extraction that will be extremely exploitative there. You will get financial companies operating in ways that can create instability. There is a great emphasis on crypto. Crypto mining has been offered, which is, of course, deeply ecologically damaging. And setting up these servers, it not only eats up huge amounts of power, but it also drinks water. It is a deeply water-intensive activity. And this crypto mining doesn't really benefit anyone because it is, finally, it's a bubble. It's a financial bubble. So the servers that are created and built and developed and operate in these very extractive ways end up benefiting no one except a few specific capitalists, while they damage the environment, displace people, and eventually harm the Indonesian economy. And even worse, there has been zero tariff offer from Indonesia for all imports from the US, including agricultural products. Now, it is true that currently Indonesian rice is globally competitive and it doesn't have to worry about US imports of rice, but a bunch of other sectors will be affected. And if this is the kind of deal that the US is seeking from other countries, if the Indonesian example is one, then we have to be deeply concerned about any concessions that the Indian government may make. And the implications of those, once again, will have to be factored in when we're looking at budgets for the future. If there have been concessions made in agriculture, which we will only find out later, what is being done to protect farmers in India? What are the different budgetary measures that are being, or other macroeconomic measures that have been suggested or are even being thought of to deal with that? What specifically are then the attempts to look at the problems that will be faced by women farmers, who tend to be the most marginalized, the least credit access, the least input access, the least viability in terms of the marketing? And how are they going to be coping with an influx of agricultural goods from the US, if in fact that transpires? Similarly, if there is deregulation of US multinationals, what implications will that have, not just for domestic production, but for our ecology, for our environment, for the kinds of activities that are permitted, and how will that affect local populations? We already have the most polluted cities in the world. Will we be adding to those, to the number of the cities, or to the worsening of that pollution? We already have huge problems with water scarcity. Will we be adding to those by bringing in multinationals that excessively draw on water, and so on? These are broader macroeconomic and sectoral concerns which affect everyone. But as you all know very well, these are also forces that disproportionately affect women. Women as workers, women as consumers, women as those who are responsible for bringing up children, social reproduction, and in terms of their own health and their own capacities to withstand shocks. So that's another angle that I think we have to highlight when we're considering the impact of the budget. In other words, What I'm suggesting is that along with the usual things that we always look at, we have to focus on the potential threats for the future and the likely threats in the future, and see whether budgetary allocations are in line with those potential threats. Now, all this is very important also because, the fiscal trends so far are a little disturbing. Even for the current year, the fiscal deficits of both the center and the state are up, which is not in itself a bad thing, but it is a bad thing when it means that the central government typically responds to this by cutting spending rather than raising tax revenues, which it could do easily through a whole range of measures like taxing the ultra-wealthy that we have talked about often. So the regressive nature of taxation and increasingly the regressive nature of expenditure, the granting of subsidies to large companies rather than medium and micro enterprises that women run and so on, the lack of attention to agriculture, the fobbing off of microcredit to women rather than actual bank credit on better terms. All of these have been very typical patterns of Indian monetary and fiscal strategy. But what is likely to happen now is that in the face of these larger deficits, we will see, and we have seen this over and over again, we will see cutbacks in the rest of the year in spending. This matters also because when we look at the trends in spending over the last decade, we find that the Modi government has been very successful in projecting itself as a major spender in terms of social spending. And globally, it has that reputation. It actually has the reputation across the world, in Brazil, in Latin America in general, across China and across Europe. There is a perception that the Modi government has been successful because it has put so much more money and effort into social spending. And of course, every particular scheme of the government is presented as a very big gift of the Prime Minister to the country and to the people. But what is remarkable is that, in fact, that increase in social spending of the central government hasn't happened. The central government has actually been stagnant in its social spending as a share of GDP, as a share of its own spending. Instead, the increase in social spending that India has seen over the last decade has come entirely from the state governments. And so it's really the state governments that have contributed to the kinds of expenditure that directly affect women, that immediately impact on women. And so what we have observed is that the state governments are spending more to meet the social and economic rights of citizens, even though their share of the tax revenues that the center should be sharing has been falling, because increasingly the center collects tax revenues in the forms of cesses and surcharges rather than the taxes that it would have to share with the state governments. So this too has a direct gender implication, because the state governments are not just actually responsible for meeting social and economic rights of citizens, but in the last decade, they have been the ones who have stepped up the spending to do so. And as they actually face more budget crunch, this will come down. And of course, in the face of federal government continuing to cut down, including on essential areas like the rural employment guarantee, and even in food and so on, we are going to see that this is going to become even more of a problem in terms of unequal burdens placed on women and girls across the different states. It will also, this again points to the fact that, as feminists, we can't just look at federal, we have to look at the center-state fiscal relationship. And we have to see how that impacts gender relations across different states. Because yes, some states are better than others in terms of the kind of spending that would affect women in preferable ways. But all states are negatively affected, and opposition rule states tend to be even worse affected, which means that their compulsions become even greater and their constraints become greater in terms of their ability to provide the essential kinds of requirements that meet the social and economic needs of people, and particularly the needs of women. Now, what we have found in the last few months, and this is looking at, if you like, what are currently called the real-time expenditure of a range of areas. There was a period in China when Chinese national accounts and Chinese statistics were very dubious and suspect, and people across the world had started disbelieving the numbers. This is actually true again in China, and I would argue it's also true in a bunch of other countries like India. In fact, India and China rank now equally in terms of data reliability. We were given the grade C by the global statistical kinds of services. But at that time, when China's data was seen as macroeconomic data was seen as suspect, the then Prime Minister Li Keqiang, in an interview sort of off the record, but which was then became widely public, said that he doesn't trust the Chinese numbers himself. He looks at only three indicators. He looks at bank lending, electricity usage, and rail cargo. So I decided, let me look at these indicators. And in fact, they're all in the last few months down or stagnant. They're not improving. And particularly the bank lending to the rural sector and is all down. I mean, the individual consumer credit has not decelerated. All the other bank credit has decelerated. But individual consumer credit is also decelerating, but at a higher rate, which is not necessarily a good thing. You will get many more people who perhaps will be unable to pay their house loans or pay for their consumer credit or their credit card debt or whatever. But the fact is that overall, the bank credit that is important as an indicator has not been going up in the way that would suggest, high growth and dynamism. Electricity usage, similarly, there's been a little bit of volatility, but broadly stagnant over the past few months. This suggests that we are actually in a period of slowdown in the economy, and that fits with a lot of the other things we see, the desperation for formal jobs, despite the claims that formal jobs are increasing, which they are not. The fact that the problems of lack of employment and poor quality employment are now no longer confined even to very low income or middle income households, but are also feeding into upper income groups even in sectors that were earlier thought immune from that, like software and so on. We find that the real-time indicators of the past few months in particular are not showing dynamism. And that means that there is really a need for a fillip. Now, the government actually does seem to understand that there is a need for a stimulus, but its approach to stimulus is entirely in terms of large-scale capital expenditure, often designed in ways that would benefit primitive accumulation by those associated with the rulers in terms of land acquisition and so on, or designed to assist some of the very large companies that are also beneficiaries of public largesse. That doesn't necessarily generate employment, and increasingly a lot of that public expenditure, including on roads, generates less and less employment because it is much more mechanized, and a lot of the large-scale investment is also more automated. So the issue of employment, which has been such a major, major problem in India for such a long time, and it's becoming a really intense crisis now, and I would argue is a major expression of the inequalities that we have in India, combined with that concentration of incomes at the top, which I talked about globally, but it is even more evident in India. The concentration of incomes and of wealth. Wealth is even more unequal than income. That concentration combines to generate government policies that actually continue this process and accentuate this process. I think these are some of the things that we have to look out for when we assess budgets. And I'm sure all of you are going to do an excellent job of doing that, because I know from your work, and I know from many of your specific inputs over the years, that you're very good at highlighting the specific sectoral and other implications of patterns of revenue raising and patterns of spending. I hope that this time you also factor in the potential problems of the future and provide genuine alternative patterns, alternative fiscal strategies that would be more progressive. And I also hope that you consider how state governments can respond to what is going to be a much more problematic and dire situation in the near future, because I think that too is a major arena for feminist economists to be talking about, not just complaining about decentralization and the extremely partisan pattern of public spending by the central government, but also thinking of ways that state governments can deal with such a situation. And with that, I really, as I said, I wish I could be there with you and listen to a lot of the deliberations, but I'm happy to have had this chance to talk to you at all, and I really hope you all the best for a really successful conference.